Hello, everyone. I'm Feven.
I'm Charlotte.
I'm Vivien.
And I'm Caleb. Through this website, we hope to inform the public about anti-Asian prejudice against each Asian Americans through images and videos to evoke radical empathy. We chose to make a website because in this digital age, this was the most effective way to educate a larger audience. Now I'll hand it off to Feven, who will discuss the history of anti-Asian prejudice against East Asian Americans.
Let's begin by first defining prejudice. According to the Encyclopedia of Child Behavior and Development, prejudice refers to a preconceived judgment, opinion, or attitude directed toward certain people based on their membership in a particular group. It is a set of attitudes which supports, causes, or justifies discrimination. Now, in order to understand how to fight racism and discrimination happening today, the history behind this prejudice must first be explored to learn how deep the roots of exclusion run. First, let's take a look at the history of prejudice towards Chinese Americans, and we'll do this by having a mini photo tour of the Chinese American experience. Anti-Chinese sentiments within the US can be traced back to the 1850s, when Chinese people migrated to the United States to work in the gold mines due to the American gold rush, as we can see here. They worked agricultural jobs, they did factory work, and worked on railroads, as we can see here. Chinese immigrants had financial burdens causing them to work for any price because they mainly migrated to the US for jobs in order to send financial support to their families back in China, and they had to repay the loans to Chinese merchants that paid for their journey to America. This gap in financial pressures between Chinese and non-Chinese workers largely contributed to the rise in anti-Chinese sentiments because non-Chinese workers felt that their jobs were being stolen by Chinese immigrants since employers hired them in order to pay them low wages. The influx of Chinese immigrants led to the rise of Chinatowns, and a negative image was given to these Chinatowns as being hubs of doing bad things like smoking opium or visiting prostitutes, so that anti-Chinese legislation advocates could argue that the cultural and moral standards of American society were being cast down by Chinese immigrants. Now, due to these social tensions, anti-Chinese legislation was passed to limit Chinese immigration to the United States and exclude them from American society, as we can see from this image right here. Now, some of the legislation includes the Page Exclusion Act of 1875, which prohibited the recruitment of Chinese workers to the US and the entry of Chinese women for immoral purposes, such as prostitution, highlighting the roots of Asian women fetishization in the US. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was passed to suspend the immigration of Chinese workers for 10 years and required all Chinese people traveling in and out of the US to carry a certificate stating their status as a laborer, scholar, diplomat, or merchant. However, to aid the morale of China, the US's wartime ally during World War II, the Chinese Exclusion Acts were repealed in 1943. However, harsh restrictions on Chinese immigration and discrimination against Chinese people were still increasing in the US. Now let's take a look at Japanese American history of prejudice. There was a large migration of Japanese immigrants to the US from 1898 to 1907. Specifically to the West Coast. However, these Japanese immigrants faced similar anti-Asian discrimination as the Chinese for reasons such as fear they would steal jobs. Japanese immigration was restricted in the US, especially towards workers. Alien land laws were also passed in 1913 and 1920 to prevent non-citizens from owning property in California, which targeted Japanese Americans living in California who were not considered citizens. On November 22, 1922, the US Supreme Court ruled in the Ozawa versus the United States case to prevent Japanese people from becoming naturalized citizens on the basis of race, which lasted until 1952. This ruling was significant in strengthening the us versus them mentality among Americans because by denying citizenship, the US stripped Japanese people of their rights, ultimately excluding them from American society. However, World War II led to exclusion on an extreme scale after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, which the video I'm about to play will explain.
As of 1941, Japanese American communities had been growing in the U.S. for over 50 years. About 1/3 of them were immigrants, many of whom settled on the West Coast and had lived there for decades. The rest were born as American citizens, like Aki. Born Akiko Kato in Seattle, Aki grew up in a diverse neighborhood where she never thought of herself as anything but American until the day after the attack, when a teacher told her, "You people bombed Pearl Harbor." Amid racism, paranoia, and fears of sabotage, people labeled Japanese Americans as potential traitors. FBI agents began to search homes, confiscate belongings, and detain community leaders without trial. Aki's family was not immediately subjected to these extreme measures, but on February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. The order authorized the removal of any suspected enemies, including anyone of even partial Japanese heritage, from designated military areas. At first, Japanese Americans were pushed to leave restricted areas and migrate inland. But as the government froze their bank accounts and imposed local restrictions such as curfews, many were unable to leave, Aki's family among them. The Army moved Aki and her family, along with over 7,000 Japanese Americans living in Seattle, to Camp Harmony in Puyallup, Washington. This was one of several makeshift detention centers at former fairgrounds and racetracks, where entire families were packed into poorly converted stables and barracks. Over the ensuing months, the Army moved Japanese Americans into long-term camps in desolate areas of the West and South, moving Aki and her family to Minidoka in southern Idaho. Guarded by armed soldiers, many of these camps were still being constructed when incarcerees moved in. These hastily built prisons were overcrowded and unsanitary. People frequently fell ill and were unable to receive proper medical care. The War Relocation Authority relied on incarcerees to keep the camps running. Many worked in camp facilities or taught in poorly equipped classrooms, while others raised crops and animals. Our Supreme Court case ruled that continued detention of American citizens without charges was unconstitutional. In the fall of 1945, the war ended and the camps closed down. Remaining incarcerees were given a mere $25 and a train ticket to their pre-war address, but many no longer had a home or job to return to.
So as we can see from the video, Japanese Americans were wrongfully discriminated against for simply being ethnically Japanese. Now let's take a brief look at Korean American history of prejudice. Korean immigrants included war brides who were Korean wives of American soldiers, Korean orphans adopted by American families, and about 27,000 students, businessmen, and intellectuals who migrated to the United States during the Korean War. War brides were alienated against because of the cultural barrier and because they were required to remain on military bases, secluding them from both the American and Korean communities. GI babies were adopted Korean children with mixed ethnic ancestry. Since their fathers were American soldiers, these GI babies faced massive discrimination because they were of mixed race, fatherless, and their mothers were treated as prostitutes who had given birth to racially impure babies. On the other hand, the Korean intellectuals and businessmen that migrated to the United States still suffered from some racism, but were for the most part well accepted and integrated into American society, ultimately transforming into the model minority. Now, let's explore the negative implications this history has on East Asians as a whole. Unfortunately, the racism and prejudice spread to other East Asian ethnicities because Americans couldn't differentiate between the various ethnicities due to similar facial features and complexion, ultimately causing East Asians to be seen as one group sharing one identity. Now, the yellow peril was a racist metaphor coined in order to represent East Asians as a threat to the Western world due to increased immigration to Western countries. The yellow peril was first meant for the Chinese, specifically the foreignness of Chinese culture, their large population size, and potential for imperialism. However, as more East Asians migrated, this term was broadened to include them too. This picture depicts not China, but Japan as an angelic figure shedding light and enlightenment on the people in darkness, representing the Western world. This picture ultimately symbolizes the yellow peril, or the fear that East Asia would overtake the Western world. Furthermore, the history behind Asian Americans being seen as harbingers of disease, came from the idea that China was a land of decay and degeneration, which was believed to be where infectious disease stemmed from. However, this racial bias spread to include other East Asian communities because of their resemblance to Chinese people and Americans' ignorance toward differentiating between the different ethnic communities. Now, history plays a significant and crucial role in understanding contemporary society's discriminatory treatment toward Asian Americans, since repercussions from the prejudice of past centuries are still felt today. Now I pass it on to Charlotte to delve into the prevalence of prejudice towards East Asian Americans in the US.
Thank you, Feven. Historical and modern-day trends are a couple of the ways in which we are able to track prejudice. Prejudice can come in many forms, and many negative consequences may arise as a result of unchecked prejudice. One of the most recognizable negative consequences are hate crimes against Asian Americans. A hate crime is a crime that is motivated by hostility towards the victim as a result of their connection to a group based on race, gender, sexual orientation, and more. Although Asian Americans have always experienced hate crimes, the hate crimes they face are significantly different from the hate crimes against African Americans and Hispanics. An offender in a hate crime against Asian Americans is more likely to be non-white, and the situations in which Asian Americans fall victim to hate crimes differ from the situations of other minorities. Asian Americans have a much higher risk of being attacked by strangers and at school, while less likely to be attacked in their homes. Violence against Asian Americans has been on the rise in the past couple decades. A study conducted in 2021 found that bias-motivated crime against Asian Americans has steadily increased at a rate of 12% each year from 2012 to 2014. This increase over time can be seen in New York City, with a few crime statistics here that contrast the change from 2008 to 2019. Asian Americans only account for 5.7% of the population in the United States, so it is important to consider this proportion when determining significance. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in the US, hate crimes against Asian Americans have spiked dramatically. In a 3-month span between March and June of 2020, over 2,100 anti-Asian American hate crimes potentially related to COVID-19 were reported. In another research study, a survey of police departments in 16 major cities found a 149% increase in hate crimes from 2019 to 2020. Former President Trump can be seen as a perpetuator for this rise in violence against Asian Americans. His use of language such as Wuhan virus, China virus, or Chinese virus, and Kung flu to describe COVID-19 has led many people to believe that these phrases are politically correct and can be used. Almost 25% of hate crimes against Asian Americans that were tracked in 2020 had an offender who used similar language. Though the pandemic has slowed down, it definitely hasn't slowed down crime or violence against Asian Americans in the US. Moving towards gendered racism towards Asian Americans, like all other minority groups, men and women face different forms of discrimination and prejudice that not only degrades the color of their skin, but their gender as well. Asian American men are often stereotyped as being effeminate or asexual. This results in harassment and disrespect due to the toxic masculinity found in so many American spaces. On the other hand, Asian American women are hypersexualized in America. They're often described as exotic and seen as being passive. This objectification results in increased violence, and the normalized aggression has been around for decades. Earlier, Feven mentioned the 1875 Page Act, which prevented Chinese women from entering the United States because all Chinese women seeking to enter the US were believed to be prostitutes. In San Francisco, around the same time, Chinese women were treated with hostility by local public health officials who feared that they would spread sexually transmitted diseases to white men. In the mid-20th century, contact between American soldiers and Asian women rose due to increased US wars and military bases stationed in East Asia. Asian women near the military bases were either on-base service workers who cooked and cleaned, or sex workers. The women only perpetuated the stereotype that the soldiers already believed. On-base service workers were seen as submissive and passive, and the sex workers added to the hypersexualization of women. A few instances of violence against Asian American women as a result of their hypersexualization include the kidnapping of 5 Japanese female exchange students by a group of white men who wanted to fulfill their sexual fantasies in 2000, white Stanford student Brock Turner raping an Asian American woman in 2015, and a very recent case from this year. In Atlanta, Robert Long shot and killed 8 people in 3 different Asian spa locations. 6 of the 8 victims were Asian American women. The 3 cases above are just a small percentage of the hundreds of violent crimes against women as a result of gendered racism. And the following statistics depict the prevalence of different forms of violence against Asian American women. When it comes to recording the prevalence of prejudice, a lot of data comes from research. However, there's a significant lack of research and coverage for Asian Americans, despite being one of the fastest growing racial or ethnic groups in the US. Asian Americans are frequently denied leadership opportunities and are overlooked in research, clinical outreach, and advocacy efforts. Most empirical studies focus on other groups of color, which enforces the belief that violence against Asian Americans is rare. Without many studies being done on Asian Americans, there are few recognizable patterns in anti-Asian hate crimes other than the ones in the studies I mentioned above. According to the National Institute of Health, the general nature of victims, offenders, offenses, and conditions of hate crimes against Asian Americans remains largely unknown, and a lack of coverage and research has led many Asian Americans to be less likely to view discrimination against their group as a major issue. In a study conducted by the Pew Research Center, 13% of Asian Americans don't think that discrimination against their group is a problem, 48% believe it's a minor problem, and 35% say it's not a problem at all. In a different study conducted by the Asian American Journal of Psychology, 99.4% of a group of 165 Asian American high schoolers reported experiencing stereotyping at least once. These statistics present high numbers, but the lack of attention given to these issues causes many Asian Americans to dismiss their problems. Portrayal of Asian Americans in media is another form of prejudice in many instances. Representation is extremely important for children and plays a crucial role in a person's development and self-confidence. Many children look towards pop culture when forming their own identities, and not seeing anyone who looks or acts like them can take a toll on their development. However, not all representations are good representations. Many Asian characters in film are exaggerated and play into old stereotypes. This connects an element of shame that becomes associated with their identity. It doesn't help that many of a child's peers may make fun of the exaggerated stereotypes in media due to growing up in an environment that may not care to teach the kids otherwise. Given its importance, Asian Americans, as well as other minority groups, are still not properly represented. In one research study conducted on the frequency and role of Asian characters in films, the frequency of Asian Americans playing lead roles has increased over the past 25 years. However, the exaggerated stereotypic roles were still present, with a slight increase in more recent films. According to the Hollywood Diversity Report, Asians made up 3.4% of all film roles in 2017, and this number rose to 4.8% in 2020. There's hope that representation of Asian Americans in film will continue to rise. However, an important factor to consider is the type of roles that Asians represent. While it's good for Asian Americans to see more representation, this can have negative effects if many of the characters are representing old negative stereotypes. The following films are just a few examples of the negative representations of Asian Americans in film and media. Moving on, Vivien is going to discuss the effects of prejudice.
Thanks, Charlotte. Now let's take a deeper look into how the prejudice affects its victims and non-Asians. I'm going to explain the effects of the mono-minority myth, fetishization of Asian women, lack of representation, and how all of these contribute to the perpetual foreign assumption and identity crisis of East Asian Americans. First, let's talk about the mono-minority myth. It's used to explain Asian Americans' success as due to their innate talent and hardworking immigrant mentality, essentially achieving the American dream. They're supposed to be polite, obedient, and the poster child of how minorities should act. And because of all this, they're seen as the desirable classmate, the non-threatening person of color. And although this may seem positive, it has a detrimental effect on everyone. First, it groups all Asians into this one mold, ignoring that there's so many ethnicities being clumped into the Asian race, such as East Asians, Pacific Islanders, Indians, and so much more. So when people use this mono-minority, to make assumptions about Asians, they're stripping them of their unique ethnicity. And not only that, but it creates immense pressure for them to live up to this expectation. There was a study done in 2011 by Jeffrey Hunt and others to analyze the construct of a social identity. One participant said he didn't see himself as Chinese because he does drugs and protests the Iraq War. He associates these acts with white people. And this cultural limbo of contemplating how Asian you are due to the socialized belief of what the model minority myth tells you an Asian is, it creates an identity crisis, which I'm going to talk more about later. But Asians are seen as passive and less likely to speak up and challenge authority. Non-Asians take advantage of this so that they can exploit Asian Americans, knowing that they will remain passive. So for example, the Anti-Coolie Act of 1892 imposed monthly taxes on only Chinese business owners in California. Why? So that white Americans can monetize off of them and make them broke. A more recent example, we've all heard of the horrific AAPI hate crimes that erupted in March 2021. However, COVID-related hate crimes against Asians erupted during the beginning of the COVID outbreak, circa March 2020, but we didn't hear about it until a year later. National media didn't broadcast much of those acts against Asian Americans until a year later. And why is that? It's because it was regarded as not as important and people didn't challenge it. It created a never-ending cycle of either using Asians as a crutch or totally forgetting about them. So I touched on this very briefly, but not only does this myth exploit Asian Americans, but it's also used as a weapon to pit minorities against each other. White Americans use this myth as an explanation of why African Americans and Hispanics aren't successful. It's because they simply don't work hard enough. This is faulty logic because it completely ignores the structural barriers that only Black and Latinos endure. Poet Kathy Hong writes, Asian Americans inhabit a vague pregordial status, distrusted by African Americans, ignored by whites, unless we're being used by whites to keep the Black man down. I think this is a great quote because it articulates the notion very well of the limbo status of Asian Americans in the hierarchy system. And this TED Talk right here, Alice talks about how these seemingly positive stereotypes negatively impacts Asian Americans. And she essentially sums up everything that's on this page. So I highly recommend watching this TED Talk. So another way that Asian Americans are stereotyped is with the fetishization of Asian women. They're hypersexualized. They're seen as submissive, sexually available partners. And if you want to learn about the history about this, you can click here and it'll bring you to Feven's page where you can learn more about the US legislation acts. So as early as the 1870s, Americans were already making the association between Asian women and walking sex objects. A third of Asian American female undergraduates report being sexually assaulted during their time in college. The effect of this stereotype makes them more vulnerable to attacks. And the way that Asian women are stereotyped in literature and films perpetuates this assumption. In her 1999 film Payback, Lucy Liu was portrayed as a sexually aggressive dominatrix, which is part of the stereotype. So when people constantly read and watch these stereotypes, it makes it harder for Asian women to be seen as anything else. How Asians see themselves in media not only affects how others see them, but also their self-perception. There is a lack of true representation in the media. If Asians are portrayed in media, they're usually stereotyped as hardworking student, very strict parents, obedient, passive, essentially everything that the model minority myth tells us Asians are. A popular YouTuber, Ingrid Nilsson, said growing up as a gay Asian woman, she had low self-esteem because she was going against what was unconsciously socialized to be true of Asian women. And the picture right here, this is Ryan Higa, creator of the popular YouTube channel Niga Higa. He's one of the very few successful Asian YouTube content creators. Most of our generation, Gen Z, grew up watching YouTube. A journalist, Crystal Kim, recounts growing up following beauty tutorials on YouTube, where at the time, and still now, the majority of the content creators were white. So Crystal was trying to follow along with these videos when she had a completely different phenotype. She refused to confront the reality of why the tutorial looked different on her because she had flatter eyelids. Many minorities go through this because we're trying to apply these lessons that we see on ourselves when we have a different hair type or a different eyelid. It also adds to the feeling of being foreign because Asians are not like the people that they see in media, which is why Asian representation is so important to show us that Asians are individuals too. It wasn't until Amy from the Daily Amy blog watched Crazy Rich Asians for the first time that she realized she had been pushing away her Chinese culture for so long. After seeing Asians being portrayed as the main characters rather than this mono minority identity, she finally realized that her Asian culture was nothing to be ashamed of. This is why representation in the media is so important. Similar to the effects of the lack of representation in media, there's also a similar effect to the lack of representation in leadership roles. We've heard of the glass ceilings for women, concrete ceilings for Black people, but there's another obstacle for minorities that is not as well known, and it's called the bamboo ceiling. Although Asians are the most likely to be hired into entry-level tech jobs in Silicon Valley, they are the least likely to be promoted. In a 2017 report by Ascend Foundation, it found that Asian Americans are the least likely racial group to be promoted into Silicon Valley's management and executive levels. This is the same across the country as well. So although the model minority myth perpetuates this idea that Asian Americans are the most successful minority, they're the least likely to be hired to these top exec levels. In 2017, Goldman Sachs reported that although 27% of its US professional workforce was Asian American, only 11% of its US executives and senior managers were, and none of its executive officers were. This big disparity plays a major role in our unconscious bias. When Asians don't see people that look like them in these higher positions or positions that they strive for, it leads to self-doubt, feelings of, oh, maybe I'm not as qualified as my superiors who are all white. And on the flip side, it also leads to unconscious bias from non-Asians. When it comes time to choose who gets the promotions, they're less likely to turn to Asians because they don't see leaders as Asians. They don't see Asian leaders, which can unconsciously cause them to believe that Asians are not capable leaders. In turn, Asians get marginalized and forgotten. All of the topics that I've mentioned, they all contribute to this persistent belief that Asians are foreign. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first legal battle of these attitudes, but the reasoning behind this was because it was believed that Asians were harboring diseases, that they were bringing strange foods and non-Christian religions. Essentially, they were believed to bring a foreign threat to America, and this attitude is still present today. This video here shows that, or Helena, she actually talks about her experiences growing up as an Asian American and the microaggressions that she goes through. She, along with many other Asian Americans, they are asked questions like, where are you really from? Or, you speak English very well. It perpetuates the belief that Americans are always white. And as you can see on the graph here on your left, 64% of Asian Americans were asked if they were from the US, and 41% of proficient English-speaking Asian Americans said that they had people ask if they spoke English. All of these remarks about their proficiency in English, or assuming that they're all from abroad, they're all forms of racism. They simultaneously attacked Asians' race and their immigration status. There have been several studies that found strong associations between being a victim of perceived racism and depression among Asian Americans. This feeling of being foreign, it creates this pressure to assimilate. And I feel like the perfect representation of this is the experience of the school cafeteria. Now, many minorities go through this. This is not unique to Asian Americans, but it's a feeling of opening your lunchbox to an ethnic lunch and immediately being bullied for it. Eddie Huang, the author of the book Fresh Off the Boat, recalled how no one wanted to sit with the stinky kid. Even if they didn't sit with me, they'll still stand across the room, pointing at me with their noses pinched, eyes pulled back, telling ching-chong jokes. This horrible cafeteria experience taught Asians at a very young age that in order to fit in, they had to act American. Now, what did it mean to act American? It meant that you didn't eat your Asian culture food. It meant even if you loved your Chinese or Korean food, in order to fit in, you had to suppress your Asian culture. And that in turn caused many Asian Americans to go through this phase of resenting their Asian culture because they're taught to work hard to blend in, and that meant not being Asian. This leads to an identity crisis. Everything that I've mentioned so far, they're all causes of this feeling of being in a cultural limbo between being an Asian and an American. In the same study that I mentioned earlier, done by Jeffrey Hunt in 2011, another participant, number 25, said that she felt torn between finding out who she was, which she classified as an American culture, and being a high achieving, obedient daughter, which she classified as Chinese culture. This navigation between balancing these two different cultures came up as a culture clash that many Asian Americans experienced. She felt like she lived a double life, trying to preserve her image with her parents as being angelic in their eyes and keeping them in the dark with her drug use and partying. She felt like if she wasn't so repressed and hadn't been raised within the Chinese culture, she would have been less likely to have a problem with drugs. Now, this can't be proven, but it's logical to assume that this immense pressure caused a lot of tension between who she really is, her identity, and she needed a sufficient outlet to express that with. Most East Asian Americans never fully feel accepted in either environment. East Asian Americans who associate closely with their Asian culture can be derogatorily called fresh off the boat or FOB. Conversely, East Asian Americans who appear more Americanized may be labeled as whitewashed or a banana. When they don't have adequate avenues to cope with this tension, the youth are at risk for depression and anxiety. So because of that, East Asian Americans experience tension in both cultures. There's prejudice against them if they act too American, prejudice against them if they act too Asian. If they're unable to reconcile these conflicting values, they can experience an identity crisis, and it can negatively impact their self-esteem, mental health, and relationships. Amy from the Daily Amy blog said, I grew up most of my life in this weird in-between of not being Asian enough for my family, but not being white enough for my peers. And I feel like she's not the only one who felt this way among Asian Americans and other minorities. So as you can see, the model minority myth that many of us have unconsciously internalized have all of these effects. And everything that I've mentioned, they all feed off of one another to perpetuate these negative effects. Now I'm going to turn it over to Caleb, who's going to talk more about how we can combat this prejudice.
During the era of COVID-19, anti-Asian hate crimes and discrimination against Asian Americans has increased almost 150% in 2020 from 2019 in the United States' largest cities. In this current climate, it is therefore more important than ever to discuss the ways that racial prejudice and hating against East Asian Americans can be dismantled at various levels of society, and thus we can continue to fight against prejudice. Asian Americans have long been discriminated against in the workforce, whether through being forced onto certain jobs earlier in history or through being underrepresented among executives in the present day. Asian Americans represent 27% of professionals in the US, but only half that among executives. This can even be farther seen in the tech industry. In a diversity and inclusion report from Silicon Valley, the fact that Asian Americans are the least likely racial group to be promoted into Silicon Valley's management and executive levels, even though they are the most likely to be hired in the high-tech jobs, was excluded from the report. This, as well as other such reports, show how in the present day there's still a significant need for reform involving Asian American representation among executive positions. Studies have also shown that diversity and inclusion programs that are implemented by companies can result in higher levels of self-efficacy and Asian American representation among executive fields. Aspects of an effective diversity program are being data-driven and carefully reviewing the retention and promotion rates of Asian Americans in analysis of race and gender, and the race at which Asian Americans are involved at upper management levels, which also differs based off of gender and type of job. Making sure to have open, visible, and proactive support from the CEO and the executive team. Without this, it can appear as if these programs can be put into corporate inertia and never be executed. And then finally, it is important to establish that Asian American leadership is an ongoing priority for the company and not just a one-time special diversity gimmick. Throughout the history of American cinema, Asians in film have also often been presented in racist and stereotyped roles. This included as far back in the early stages of cinema, in which white actors were either cast as Asian roles or were played as white saviors in otherwise Asian-led films. Meanwhile, Asian American actors were typically typecast into exotic roles, while white actors got to play the lead. Even in the present day, movies like Ghost in the Shell and Annihilation, rather than casting Asian American actors or actresses in the lead roles, such as specified in the source material, the studios instead opted to cast white leads. This lack of representation is extremely important, as those stereotypes seen on the screen, such as Asian Americans being all overachievers who obtain financial and economic stability, can have harmful effects on warping how the public sees the affected group. This includes harmful effects on children, who may watch the omission of Asians in film and internalize a perceived invisibility within society outside of the media they consume. This highlights the importance of Asian representation in film and media, and yet despite this, a report showed that while Asian Americans make up 5.4% of the United States population, they represented just 1.4% of lead characters in studio films in 2014. However, that is not to say that there has been no progress in increasing Asian American representation over time. The movie Crazy Rich Asians, released in 2018, starred an all-Asian cast and earned $238 million at the box office. This movie would end up being the highest-grossing rom-com in a decade. This was a watershed moment for East Asian representation, as not only gave Asian Americans representation in Hollywood, but also showed film companies that diversifying the movies can be extremely profitable. However, diversifying movies and TV shows just by hiring Asian American actors is not enough to combat prejudice against Asian Americans in cinema. Having more Asians in behind-the-scenes positions is also important, as they can create authentic stories from their own experiences, which allows for more nuanced take in how their race affects the story. Finally, it is also important to not frame content created by or starring Asians as solely being Asian films. Doing this creates a divide between what is perceived as normal versus Asian, and can further harm how Asian Americans are perceived in media. All of this shows that as long as it is done properly, Asian American representation in cinema can prevent harmful stereotypes from spreading, while also being profitable for companies, proving its importance. Here we can see a photo of the cast of Crazy Rich Asians, and it's with it being entirely East Asian. In this video by the New York Times, it shows that the effect that coronavirus has had on Asian American students in the classroom, which highlights the need for education on anti-Asian racism. In the fight against anti-Asian prejudice, one of the most important ways to prevent anti-Asian hate from spreading is to stop it from occurring in the latest generation. This can be done through education specialized on instructing students about the history of racism against Asians, as well as how to recognize and call it out when they see it occur. Doing this will also help AAPI students feel safe at school, as they will feel more accepted by the community they live in. Various websites have put out lessons plans in which they can teach students the various ways that anti-Asian discrimination has happened throughout the history of the United States. One such lesson plan was made by Asian Americans Advancing Justice, which came up with a lesson plan through grades K through 12. This plan goes much more in depth over the history of anti-Asian racism, detailing Asian American history starting from the 1950s all the way to the 2010s. This includes reviewing the Chinese Exclusion Act, segregation in schools, Asian Americans in politics and cinema, as well as reviewing landmark court cases in the Asian American community's fight for equality. By using this lesson plan, it is possible to have students explore the history of anti-Asian hate in depth and truly learn why Asian American equality is important and how to recognize anti-Asian discrimination when they see it. There are many organizations that are fighting anti-Asian discrimination through various means, such as lobbying in politics, offering digital services to AAPI people, offering a place to report AAPI hate crimes, and assimilating agreements with various challenges they may face. After the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes due to COVID-19, these groups, of which a few are listed here, are more dedicated than ever to helping AAPI communities through whatever ways possible. Stop AAPI Hate launched on March 19, 2020, in response to the increase in anti-Asian hate crimes after the COVID-19 pandemic began. This organization serves as a lead aggregator of anti-Asian hate crimes while also offering support services to those affected by hate crimes. Anti-Asian hate crimes can be reported to the organization, and they will offer support to those affected in the form of monetary and legal assistance. Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Founded in 1991, their mission is to advocate for the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and build a fair and equitable society for all. They do this through education, litigation, and public policy advocacy. Some examples of the public policy advocacy they've been involved in is fighting against legislation that creates barriers to voting, that discriminates against Asian Americans, pushing for stronger legislation against hate crimes, and giving limited English proficient individuals greater access to government services. On top of this, like Stop AAPI Hate, it is possible to report anti-Asian hate crimes to their website. Other groups now that exist are Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, which is an organization that promotes the civil rights of Asian Americans through litigation, advocacy, and organizing. And AAPI Women Lead, which the goal of which is to raise visibility around AAPI women and their experiences with both the Me Too movement and racial discrimination. Donating to these and other organizations is a good way to help show your support for the AAPI community. However, that is not all that must be done. On an individual level, we must be able to call out anti-Asian discrimination when we see it, and do our best to prevent the spread of hate and support the AAPI community through this wave of anti-AAPI hate crimes in the wake of COVID. Our website utilizes the ability to depict images and videos alongside text to bring you an understanding of the Asian American experience that delves deeper than words can reach. These various elements are combined together to create a more well-rounded picture for our audience to not only visually, but plant the seeds of activism that stems from radical empathy.